He won't do a thing. Dude probably doesn't even remember what day it is. That's what the teen mumbled to his buddy as they crept behind the elderly man standing at the outdoor cash machine. But the instant he tapped the man's shoulder, everything flipped. His wrist wrenched in an instant, the ground rushing up to greet his face. His plan evaporated in the time it took him to blink. His ego cracked even faster than his confidence. If you still believe true strength isn't measured in muscle or youth, but in mastery and calm, type respect in the comments to honor those who still move with silent power. Earl, age 74, lived a quiet life in the sleepy outskirts of Redwood Hollow. Every morning, rain or shine, he walked exactly 2 miles to the corner market. He'd pick up a plain black coffee, offer a nod to the cashier, and walk back the same route, never in a rush, never drawing attention. To most people, he was just another soft-spoken retiree in a faded jacket and dusty work boots. His back slightly bowed with age, his footsteps measured, hands always loose at his sides. No one suspected that Earl had once served over 3 decades, in uniform, most of it as a lead instructor for elite special forces units. He had mentored the very men who'd go on to lead others, forging warriors with precision, patience, and unshakable discipline. He didn't talk about it. Didn't need to. His silence carried the weight of a man who had nothing to prove. That Thursday morning, Earl had stopped by the pharmacy to refill his prescription, then headed toward the outdoor ATM under the soft glare of the sun. He stood quietly, entering his PIN with the same calm routine he followed every month. A few steps behind him, 2 teens lingered under the shadow of the awning. One wore a sagging hoodie, eyes darting. The other held up his phone, already recording. They'd spotted Earl minutes earlier, trailing him from the corner. His slow pace, the way he carefully folded his bills, it all screamed easy pickings to them. "Snatch his wallet and dip. Bet that check just hit," one whispered, snickering. "Old man ATM takedown. Watch this go viral," the other added, holding the camera steady. Just as Earl reached for his modest withdrawal, the kid in the hoodie lunged and barked, "Hand it over, old man." But he never finished the sentence. In one smooth motion, Earl shifted. One step, one twist, one calculated movement, and the teen was face down on the pavement, his arm pinned in a joint lock he couldn't even begin to resist. Earl crouched beside him, voice calm as a winter. "Lake, Rule 1. Assess the hands, not the wrinkles." The teen gasped, stunned. What the hell? Who are you?" The second kid stood frozen, phone still rolling, mouth agape. The story he thought he was filming, a helpless old man being punked, was now unraveling in real time. Earl didn't yell, didn't need to. "I've dealt with bullies longer than you've been alive," he said, applying just enough pressure to make sure the kid wouldn't try anything foolish, yet never enough to injure. Every motion came from decades of precision, training soldiers. In combat, de-escalation, survival. People nearby began to gather, eyes wide. They expected chaos, but what they saw was an elderly man in control, composed, unshaken. A presence they didn't expect from someone with gray hair and a slight limp. When the police arrived, summoned by multiple reports of an altercation at the ATM, Earl was already stepping back, arms at his sides, palms open in the universal stance of peace. The officers first checked the teenager, bruised more in pride than body, then looked at Earl, standing still with quiet dignity. "We got a call that an older guy assaulted a minor," one officer said cautiously, hand hovering near his belt. "He tried to mug me," Earl explained, voice even. "I just held the situation until help showed up." The other teen, sensing trouble, stepped in with his phone. "I got it all here. He body slammed him to the concrete." But the footage was conveniently trimmed. Just the takedown, none of the build-up. A distorted version of events that painted Earl as the aggressor. The officers exchanged glances, uncertain who to believe, the trembling kid or the old man with lightning reflexes. "We'll figure it out at the station," they decided, guiding, each party into separate vehicles. Word spread like wildfire. By that afternoon, every porch in Redwood Hollow was buzzing. Did you hear about the old guy who beat up some punk at the ATM? No way. Earl? People couldn't believe it. The man they'd seen buying black coffee and waving at kids from across the street? At the station, Earl sat alone in an interview room for nearly 3 hours, hands folded, eyes distant. It wasn't the first time he'd waited like this, just the first time back home. No charges were filed. The evidence was too murky. No one apologized either. The next day, a local newspaper ran the headline, "Retired man subdues teen outside bank using military moves." It didn't accuse, but it didn't defend him either. Online, the video spread fast, cut short, out of context, and without nuance. Comment sections exploded. "These old military types think they're vigilantes. Some boomer snapped. Lock him up before he snaps again." Nobody cared about the full story. Nobody knew Earl still visited injured vets every Thursday at the VA, or how he shoveled his neighbors' driveways after snowstorms, quietly, without asking. To the internet, he was now Karate Grandpa, a meme, a threat, a target. That evening, Earl came home to 3 voicemails from blocked numbers. One of them was just breathing. Another whispered, "You think you're above the law?" He didn't react, didn't check his cameras, just sat. On his porch, as the sky dimmed, watching the street with the same calm eyes he had in Mogadishu, in Kandahar, in cities no one could pronounce. Because he knew. The worst wounds weren't from enemies overseas. They were from the people you thought you'd been protecting all along. The very next day, while Earl sat alone at his regular booth in the tiny diner he'd visited nearly every morning for the last 15 years, something changed. Patrons who used to greet him with casual smiles now kept their distance. A couple slid out of their seats and left without finishing their meal, the man murmuring something about safety as he passed. Jenny, the waitress who'd known his usual order for over a decade, brought his coffee without a word, avoiding his eyes. "Rough week, huh?" she said with a forced smile, already walking away before he could respond. Earl didn't take offense. He just nodded and sipped his coffee, silently observing the town he'd once defended from a distance, now retreating from him like he was something foreign. He wasn't angry, not even bitter. He'd spent most of his life in places where misunderstanding could be fatal, but it still cut deep, realizing the people he'd fought for now saw him as dangerous, just because he refused to be a victim. That night his phone rang again. This time the voice was clearer. "We know who you are." Then silence. No threats, no names, just fear dressed up as intimidation. But Earl didn't lock his door, didn't dig out any weapons from storage. He didn't need to. He sat outside like always, porch light casting a soft halo over the steps, hands resting on his knees, steady, still. He'd seen worse, much worse. And then, just after noon the following day, a black SUV with government plates rolled up in front of that very same diner. It wasn't marked, but you didn't need to be in the military to recognize the man who stepped out. He stood tall, square-jawed, with a stride that spoke of command. His suit couldn't hide the posture of a soldier. On his lapel, 3 stars gleamed in the sunlight. Inside, the diner grew still. Conversations stopped, heads turned. "Who is that?" someone whispered. "That's a general, right?" another said, squinting at the insignia. Without hesitation, the man walked directly to Earl's booth. "Master Sergeant Earl McKinley?" he asked, his voice carrying authority that didn't need volume. Earl stood slowly, back straightening out of pure reflex. "Yes, sir," he replied. The general raised his hand and saluted. "You trained me in '89, saved my life in a back alley in Mogadishu." A silence fell like a blanket over the diner, forks frozen mid-air, every pair of eyes locked on the 2 men standing. The general continued, "I saw that video. So did the Secretary of Defense. We know what really happened, and we're not staying." silent. He placed a sleek wooden case on the table. Inside, a commendation plaque etched with Earl's name, signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was signed this morning. For decades of dedicated service to your country, and for reminding us all what true restraint looks like. At that moment, photographers burst in. The press had caught wind of the general's arrival. The uncut video had just been released, thanks to Pentagon cyber experts who'd retrieved the original footage from a cloud backup. It showed everything: the stalking, the attempted mugging, and Earl's controlled response. Public perception flipped almost instantly. News stations ran back-to-back coverage. Military analysts praised Earl's technique. He didn't lash out. He neutralized a threat with minimal force. "That's training. That's control," one veteran said during a live interview. The boys in the video, now exposed, stood beside their parents at a press conference, apologizing publicly. One could barely speak. The other stared at the floor, face flushed with shame. The community turned quickly, from suspicion to admiration. People who had once avoided Earl now wanted to shake his hand, and some wanted to learn from him. One man, a father of 3, knocked on Earl's door with his teenage son. "He needs guidance," the man said. "Structure, discipline. Would you consider teaching him?" Earl hesitated, but something in the kid's eyes reminded him of younger soldiers he'd mentored years ago. So he agreed, quietly, cautiously. With encouragement from the mayor, Earl began offering free self-defense workshops at the community center. At first, only a handful of people showed up. Then it became 20, then 50. Soon, veterans from nearby towns were attending. Teenagers, too, some out of curiosity, others out of respect. Even local police officers asked to join, learning control-based techniques that emphasized calm, awareness, and confidence without escalation. A month later, General Mason returned, this time with a camera crew. They filmed a PSA on veteran respect and community safety, featuring Earl. "Some warriors never stop serving," Mason said, standing beside him. "They just change how they serve, by teaching, guiding, and protecting quietly." During the shoot, Earl demonstrated a defensive technique to a group of college students. His movements were fluid, intentional, and impossibly smooth for someone in their 70s. But mastery doesn't age. It just evolves. Media coverage exploded. National networks picked up the story. Headlines read, "Silent Veteran, Loud Legacy," and "From Viral Shame to National Hero." Earl began receiving letters, hundreds of them, from former students, fellow veterans, and strangers who'd watched the full video. "You reminded us what service really means," one note read. Another said, "You showed the world that protecting others doesn't end with retirement. It changes form." One moment in particular stood out. A young man missing a leg, former Special Forces, drove across 3 states just to train under Earl. "When I saw that clip," he said, "I remembered who I used to be. You brought that back." Earl didn't say much, never did. But that day, when the young man called him Master Sergeant with tear-filled eyes, Earl simply placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. 6 months after the incident, the city unveiled a bronze plaque beside the ATM, where it all began. It read, "Here, one man reminded a generation what silent strength looks like." The community center officially renamed their training hall the McKinley Defense Academy. Earl was there, standing stiff in his pressed jacket as the ribbon was cut. Dozens of students clapped. Cameras flashed. But he still looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. One college student later told a reporter, "I used to feel nervous walking home. Now I feel aware. I carry myself differently. And that's all because of what Sergeant McKinley taught us." To her, Earl simply said, "It's not about how strong you are. It's how you carry yourself. Confidence is your first shield." Every Veterans Day, General Mason still sends Earl a handwritten letter. No emails, no texts, just paper and ink. the way warriors honor each other. As for the teen who tried to rob him, after serving community service and completing required counseling, he asked Earl if he could volunteer at the workshops. Earl accepted. The boy now calls him Sir and assists during class. The two rarely talk about what happened, but everyone watching knows something powerful came from it. The local police department even launched a youth outreach initiative with Earl as their consultant. "It's not about winning fights," the chief said. "It's about reading danger, avoiding conflict, and walking with confidence." Today, Earl still sits on his porch most evenings, eyes scanning the neighborhood. But now, instead of cold glances, he's met with waves. Parents point him out to their children, explaining who he is, what he's done. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder. And when newcomers ask him about the day at the ATM, Earl always gives the same answer. "He figured I was slow. Forgot I spent 30 years teaching others how to move." Then he smiles, just a little. The kind of smile that doesn't need explanation, because some lessons aren't taught in words. And some warriors never truly retire.